On November 13th, 1820, American sailor Henry Palmer and his men landed on an island close to the Antarctic Peninsula he eventually named Deception Island. What happened over the next 2 days was mysterious and unbelievable. For the longest time, Palmer refused to make the grisly details public of what happened, finally revealing the disturbing events that took place shortly before his death in 1877. What happened 137 years later when a group of Australian scientists landed on the island was even more horrific, adding more speculation the island should be left alone and uninhabited. Research stations have been set up and abandoned over the years due to various reasons, some of which remain unknown. The events that took place in 1957 were kept a secret by the Australian government for decades, before one of the scientists, American-born Richard McCready, eventually broke his silence of what happened there. This is Henry Palmer's story. It's been transcribed to present-day English. As I set foot on the shore of what I later named Deception Island, a sense of uneasiness overcame me. I'd set foot on many shores over the years as a sailor and never had that feeling before, so I was slightly taken aback. As I looked around, I got the feeling I was being watched. I knew there shouldn't be any humans on the island, save for some wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling something or someone was out there. I told my men to set up camp just above high tide, being it was getting close to evening and we didn't know the area. We planned on exploring at first light. Whenever we set up camp on a new shore, each morning we do a head count to assure no one disappeared during the night. I still remember the first morning as I took a sip of coffee, someone yelling out, "Norris and Clark are gone." I ran over to the tent they shared, looked inside, and could see they were in fact missing. I called everyone over and quickly established 4 search parties to scour the island for them. I instructed them to have their weapons at the ready. I picked 2 other men to go with me and we all set off in different directions. As we walked along the beach heading for a rock outcropping, the other men and I discussed where they could be or what might have happened. One rule I have is no one leaves camp without notifying me or the first mate, George, of where they're going. Even when they're going to relieve themselves, they must notify us and stay within sight, as we never know what lurks in the unknown places we explore. After walking for a spell, we came to what looked like human footprints in the sand, and clothing belonging to one of the men. There was something else in the sand that immediately raised our suspicions. There appeared to be drag marks in the sand, indicating something was dragged. Right then, up ahead, not too far away, we noticed a cave at the bottom of the outcropping of rocks, exactly where the footprints were leading to. "Edward, be ready with your rifle. Something seems off to me," I said. "Aye, sir," he responded as he raised his rifle to his shoulder. As we cautiously walked towards the cave, I removed my pistol from its holster and cocked the hammer back. We said nothing as we got closer and closer to the cave, but I could tell the tension in the air was high. These men were sailors, not warriors. I'd fought in the War of 1812 and had seen my fair share of death, and had also caused many deaths. So unfortunately, I developed a sense of apathy that has stuck with me my entire life. I also developed something that allowed me to sense when something dire was going to happen. To me, it was a curse, a burden to bear. "Gents, I'll go in first. Be right behind me. Don't shoot anything you're not prepared to kill," I said. I decided to go in first. Being the leader of these men, I would never make them do something I wouldn't. As I got to the entrance of the cave, I could see it went a ways back and was somewhat dark with only a faint light going through. Before taking the first step inside, I took a deep breath. Times like these, I was always scared as hell, but never let on to my men I was. My premonitions have always been right since I started getting them, and I've never gotten used to them. Right as I set foot inside the cave, I heard a gurgling noise, followed by what sounded like raspy breathing. I turned, looked back at my men, and it was apparent they hadn't heard what I'd heard. I continued pushing myself forward with my pistol at the ready, in case something should come rushing at me. As we got deeper in the cave, it was getting too dark to see, so I instructed my men to light their candles, as did I. No sooner had we lit our candles, I heard what sounded like moaning and something moving about, but couldn't make out what it was. I pressed on until I came to a sharp turn in the cave. I knew something was just around the corner. I turned, looked back at my men, and said, "Men, be ready." I have a feeling whatever it is close. I could see fear in their eyes as I said that, and did my best to hold my composure as I looked at them. I continued walking, turning the corner, and as I did, I immediately stopped. There before me on the ground lay the naked bodies of Norris and Clark. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The skin on their bodies had been completely removed and looked as if their bodies had literally been turned inside out. I couldn't tell who was who. As I stood there, the one closest suddenly looked up at me, raised his arm, opening his hand, and said something I couldn't make out. I quickly walked over to him and knelt down. I could see sheer terror in his eyes as he looked up at me. I then noticed something in his hand. I held the candle next to it and could see it looked like a stone and nothing more. It had a brilliant red color to it, though, unlike any red I've ever seen. I looked at the other man who was lying next to him and could see he had the same red stone in his hand, but he appeared to be dead. Right then, the man's arm dropped and the stone went rolling along the cave floor. Edward bent down to pick it up when I stopped him, saying, "Edward, don't touch it. We have no idea what it is." He jumped, backing up against the wall. "What happened to these men, sir?" he asked. "I've no idea. Something ungodly. What could possibly do this to a man? Nothing on this earth I know of," I responded. "You two, go now. Fetch the rest of the men and bring back these men's blankets so we can carry their bodies back to camp for proper inspection," I said. As I waited in the cave for the men to come back, a sense of dread overcame me, and I knew we needed to leave the island soon. We planned on staying for 6 days, but I knew we needed to leave the following day. It wasn't long before the men came. When they saw Norris and Clark's skinless bodies, they crossed themselves and prayed. Some of the men believed it was the devil. Others said it was witchcraft. I didn't know what to believe. I just knew we needed to get off the island. I instructed the men to put their bodies in the blankets and carry them back to camp. I also forbid anyone from touching the red stones. Once we made it back to camp, we inspected their bodies for any clues as to what might have happened, but came up with no answers, only more questions. Later in the afternoon, we buried their bodies. What happened the following day assured the fact I would never return to Deception Island as long as I'm alive. When we awoke the following morning, I instructed the men to break camp as soon as they finished eating breakfast. A few of the men came to me saying they needed to relieve themselves, which of course I agreed to. As I was packing my things, I heard one of the men shout, "Palmer, get over here, now." I dropped what I was holding and took off towards the direction they'd gone. As I got closer to them, I could see one of them was pointing to something. I stopped and looked over, and to this day I can't fathom what had happened. There before me were the empty graves of Norris and Clark. My first thought was one of the men had dug up their bodies, but I quickly dismissed that. I knew these men were deathly afraid of what had happened and would never do such a thing. "Men, gather your things. We're leaving this place, now," I said. I've never seen my men move so fast as we packed up camp. I could hear them saying various things about what they thought it was as we left. I'll never forget someone saying, "This island is an evil place and should be left alone." I agree with that statement, never returning. I named it Deception Island in hopes it would deter others from visiting. This is McCready's story. I was told and threatened never to speak of what happened on Deception Island in 1957, but I don't care anymore. I owe it to the men that died there. They were my friends for years before it all happened. There were 5 of us stationed there, and it was January, which meant summer had just started. Our station was built not too far from an active volcano, so it was fairly warm most of the time, with the air sometimes getting as hot as 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The first week after we'd arrived was normal and routine. It wasn't until the 8th day it began. I remember my 2 friends and fellow scientists, Ian and Ross, returning from a day of exploring the island, having brought back sediment samples from the volcano and other interesting items they'd found, as they called it, being they were both geologists. I remember that night waking up very late to go to the restroom and walking past the room where Ian and Ross would study the samples they'd collected. They were still in there, which I thought was a bit odd. I thought maybe they were just enthusiastic about what they'd found. They were standing very close to each other with their backs turned to me and were whispering something. Being half asleep at the time, I thought nothing of it. It wasn't until much later it dawned on me it was just the beginning of something sinister. When I awoke that morning and was heading to the mess hall to eat breakfast, I again walked past the room and again saw Ian and Ross standing in the exact spot I'd seen them late last night. "Hey, morning guys, have you been standing there all night or what?" I asked. They turned their heads looking at me and only nodded, not uttering a word. I stood there for a bit waiting for them to respond, but nothing. They then turned their heads back around. I continued walking to the mess hall and thought, what the hell is up with those two? Once I entered the mess hall, I could see Peter and Max were already there eating. After getting my breakfast and sitting down with them, I asked, "Did you guys talk to Ian and Ross this morning? They're acting odd." "No, I saw them in the room standing there but didn't talk to them. Why?" replied Max. "Well, I saw them in there late last night, in the exact spot they were in this morning. When I tried talking to them, they simply turned their heads and nodded, not saying anything," I responded. Weird. Maybe they're just overly excited about the rocks they'd found. You know how giddy geologists get about rocks they've never seen before, responded Peter. "Yeah, maybe," I said. We then ate breakfast in silence. After breakfast, I walked back to my room to get dressed to head outside. I'm a marine biologist and plan on spending the day scouring the beach for various marine life when I walked past Ross and Ian's rock room, as I call it, and noticed they weren't there. I then walked to their rooms to see if they were there, but they were not. Whenever someone leaves the station, the protocol is they're supposed to let someone know where they're going and when they plan on returning. I went and told Peter and Max about it, and they dismissed it as them just forgetting. That day, as I made my way along the beach picking up and studying various marine life, I constantly kept looking over my shoulder. I had the unnerving feeling I was being watched and felt like someone was standing right behind me. Later that afternoon, I made it back to the station, and as I walked inside, Max and Peter were standing there looking at me. I instantly knew something was not right. "What's going on?" I asked. "Ian and Ross should have been back by now. They know the protocol," replied Max. "What do we do?" I asked. "What can we do? It's going to be dark soon, and I don't feel much like going outside and running around the island after dark. Do you?" responded Peter. No, I don't, but we should," I said. "It's going to be cold tonight, and they might be dressed warm enough to survive. I say let's wait here in case they do come back. If not, we'll wake up early and head out right before first light to search for them," said Peter. I nodded my head in agreement as Max said, "I don't know what the hell they're thinking. They know better than this." As the three of us ate dinner that night, none of us said much. I have no idea what was going on in their minds, but mine was racing. I didn't sleep much at all that night either, and had the weirdest thoughts as I laid there in bed. I remember Peter coming to my room very early and saying, "It's time, let's get dressed and go find them." I didn't say anything as I jumped out of bed and started getting dressed to brave the cold Arctic weather. We spent all day searching but found no trace of them. We decided to try and radio for help once we made it back to the station. Once we made it back, Max hopped on the radio and was able to reach someone on Livingston Island who said they'd send help, but it'd be the following day. They also said they would radio our headquarters in Australia, letting them know the situation. After eating dinner, we each retired to our rooms. I quickly fell asleep, being I was exhausted from all the hiking we'd done that day. Help me," someone shouted as I sat up in a panic. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not, then I heard someone shout again, "Someone, please, God help me." I couldn't make out who was shouting, but I quickly jumped out of bed, grabbing the lantern I always kept in my room, and proceeded to walk down to Max and Peter's rooms. As I got closer to Max's room, I could hear a munching sound, followed by what sounded like teeth chattering. I slowly raised the lantern as I stepped into Max's room and said aloud, "What the hell?" Even now, I have a hard time believing what I saw. There stood two men, both without their skins, eating Max. Once they noticed I was there, they turned and looked at me. I wasted no time in turning around and running down to Peter's room. Peter, get up now," I yelled as I ran. Peter was always a deep sleeper, so I wasn't surprised as I entered his room to see him still asleep. I violently shook him, saying, "Get up, we need to leave. Something's happened to Max. I'll explain later." "What are you talking about? What the hell is going on?" asked Peter. I grabbed his arm and started pulling him out of bed when I noticed the look of horror on his face. I immediately froze and turned my head to see what was behind me. "What in the name of God?" said Peter in a horrified tone. "Get up now," I said. No sooner had I finished saying that, they started coming at us. I quickly moved to my right, trying to get as far away from them as I could. Unfortunately, this allowed them to pounce on Peter. I backed up against the wall as I watched the two skinless men before me grab a hold of Peter and begin biting and taking pieces out of him. I've never in my life heard more horrific screams than I heard coming from him. I decided to run and grab the fire axe we kept in the hallway so I could help him. As I turned to head out the door, one of the men turned, looked at me, then started coming at me. In that moment, I panicked, and instead of grabbing the fire axe, my flight mode took over. All I could think about was hiding somewhere. I headed towards the mess hall as a thought came to my mind to hide inside the walk-in fridge. I knew it was going to be cold in there, but I didn't care. I was willing to take the chance. As I ran down the hallway, I happened to pass the rack that held the down jackets we'd wear outside, grabbing one as I went by. Once inside the mess hall, I made a beeline straight to the walk-in fridge, opened the door, and ran inside. I didn't waste any time removing one of the twines from a box of food so I could tie it to the fridge's handle and a heavy shelf that was in there. After tying the twine, I put the down jacket on and backed away from the door. I hadn't been there long before I heard what sounded like scratching and something trying to open the door. Whatever it was seemed to have a lot of strength as I watched the twine being stretched out to what I assumed was its limit. As I prayed, it wouldn't break. This went on for a while until I decided to turn the lantern off, leaving it pitch black inside. I then sat down in the corner, huddled up, trying to stay warm as best I could. What I had on for pants wasn't adequate for cold weather, and hoped I wouldn't get hypothermia before help arrived. The next thing I remember was being startled awake, barely being able to hear someone yelling, "Anybody here? Is there anybody here?" I jumped up, stumbled my way over to the fridge's door, and began pounding on it, saying, "I'm in here, I'm in here." "Hello in there. I'm Jorgen from the Norwegian research station on Livingston Island. We're the ones you talked to yesterday requesting help," he said in a thick Norwegian accent. I went back and turned the lantern on, then went back to the door, untied the twine, and swung the fridge door open. Seeing Jorgen standing there was the most welcome sight of my life. I immediately started looking around and asked, "Did you encounter the skinless men when you got here?" He stared at me with a puzzled look, like he might have misunderstood my English, then replied, "No, we haven't seen anyone else since we arrived. We found 2 rooms with the beds covered in blood and red stones, but nothing more. Is there anyone else here?" "No, I guess not. I'm the only one left," I replied. I followed him to meet up with the 3 other men who'd also come. As we passed Ross and Ian's bedrooms, I could see blood everywhere, along with the red stones on their beds, like he'd mentioned. As we passed their rock room, I looked down at the floor and noticed the same brilliant, red-colored stones scattered about. I don't know why, but I got the inclination the red stones had something to do with what happened. Of course, I'll never know for sure. Once the Australian government got wind of what happened, they sent a special team from Australia to investigate to see if they could find the men or their bodies. After weeks of searching, nothing was ever found. Years later in Australia, McCready was out working in his yard when he was approached by a man who asked him many questions about what had happened on the island. The man said he was from the special team that went there to investigate after the disappearance of the scientist. He said they also ran into some issues while they were there but wouldn't elaborate any further. McCready asked him if he knew anything at all that would bring him closure. The man simply responded, "Stay away from that island." For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.